Matthew 28, verses 1 through 10. I'll give you just a moment to get there. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen, just as he said. Come, see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you." So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." We did it. We made it to Easter. I love Easter. This is wonderful. As a kid, I loved Easter because I got candy. And as an adult, that's still one of the reasons why I like Easter. I'll be honest. My wife and I went to a Dollar General this week, and we made the mistake of going on an empty stomach and bought too much candy. But Easter is also an incredibly special time of the year. And we celebrate Christ's birth, the birth of hope, at Christmas time, but it is today, the day we celebrate the realization, the actualization, hope finally actually here. Hope has made it. Christ is alive and has been risen. Today is not a day that we should think deeply about our sin and mourn the things that we've done, though we must do that too. Today should only be a day to celebrate Christ, to focus on his work rather than our own shortcomings. But again, we should. But today, Christ should be the focus. So we are going to focus on that today. Even when we move to communion and we do the solemn reflection beforehand, I hope to encourage all of you today to, instead of thinking about our shortcomings, think about how great God is, that he overcame them when we didn't even want him to, when we couldn't have even had a say in the matter. Christ is alive. Christ is risen. It is a wonderful day. So let's get in right to the text. The first verse is really just set up after Sabbath. So Sabbath in Israel is Friday night around roughly 6 p.m. to Saturday night around about 6 p.m. as well. There's some conversations about, so when did Jesus actually rise? Was it on Saturday night? Was it Sunday morning? Sunday morning seems to make the most sense, because if it was the next day, they typically would have phrased it differently, but we're going to go with Sunday. I'm not going to change it. But it's an interesting conversation that is being had. It's dawn on the first day of the week. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. So what happened? Friday night, Friday morning, early, like overnight Thursday night into Friday morning, Jesus is arrested. He's drugged before the religious leaders where they ask him, "Are you the Son of God?" And Jesus' only response is, "You said it." And they said, "That's enough. Let's get him." They arrested him and drug him to Pilate. Poor Pilate, drug up at probably 4 or 5 in the morning to do this trial because, well, we've got to put down an insurrection if one's happening. But Pilate's completely confused because he doesn't understand why Jesus is even here. He's done nothing wrong. And he tries to bargain for Jesus' life, knowing in his heart that Jesus is innocent. And he says, "Hey, typically we release a guy from prison. We've got this Barabbas guy, he murdered some people in an insurrection, or we've got this Jesus who claims to be the king of the Jews." And the religious elite get the crowd stirred up to asked for the murderer rather than the innocent man who healed and saved people. There's a further irony to think about. The crowd that likely followed Jesus into Jerusalem last Sunday is likely part of the same crowd that is now going to shout and chant, "Crucify him." Jesus is beaten, flogged, crown of thorns shoved on his head, forced to walk up a hill, mocked, and then crucified. At the burial, when Pilate found out that Jesus was dead, he allowed his body to be given to Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph had a new tomb cut nearby where Jesus was crucified, and that is where he was laid. And because the religious elites suspected that the disciples might try and steal the body and claim that Jesus was alive, like he always said, they put a battalion of guards, somewhere between 4 to 10, maybe 12 guards, trained Roman soldiers, to guard this tomb, with a seal put on the tomb as well, as some Gospels tell us. The seal being broken is a death sentence. Anyone who breaks a seal from Caesar or a seal from Rome incurs a death penalty on them. And so you have this scene now. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary show up to the tomb, and they just go to look at it. We can't see Jesus. The rock is in the way. The best we can do is sit across from the road, sit across from the way, and just look at the stone, look at the tomb, and mourn. They didn't do it on Sabbath. They did it the following day, Sunday. And then this is where the text gets really interesting. See, the way Matthew phrases it, it's almost like the women show up to the tomb, and then everything that happens after happens with them watching. There's not necessarily an indication in Matthew that this was done before they arrived, or this was done in a way that they got there and everything had happened. It just as there was a violent earthquake. For an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and, going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. You can almost see this disrespect, like, you think you can lock Jesus in a tomb with a stone and a seal. I'm going to roll this thing out of the way, and I'm just going to sit on it. The stone likely would have had a small divot dug into the ground, so the rock would have rolled and rested into that spot, so pushing it out of the way. Imagine the disciples, if they were anyone else, concocting this harebrained scheme to get Jesus' body. They would have had to go, distract army battle-trained soldiers, and then a couple people would have had to roll the stone, a very heavy rock, out of this divot to then get the body. It's not going to happen. This angel so casually just moves the stone and then uses it as a seat. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. This is a reference back to Daniel. If you're curious about the reference, it's chapter 10, verse 6. I'm not going to read it, but that is the reference that this imagery is taken from that. Matthew, writing this gospel, is pulling this imagery forward. His appeared like lightning, suddenly appeared. His clothes were pure and clean and holy. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. This is almost a hilarious, ironic twist. See, the guards were hired to watch a dead man, and now they themselves are like dead men. You almost just faint from being overwhelmed, just collapse to the ground. And again, it's as if the two Marys are watching this happen, just shocked, like, angel appeared, rolls the stone away, sits on it, the guards collapse, and they're just like, jaw dropped. They don't know what to do. And the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay." So the first thing I really want to tackle today that I'm building up towards, that Jesus is arisen. And there's a second half of this text that I want to go to that I've just been so excited about, but we've got to start here. Jesus is alive. In fact, there's this idea that Jesus may have already been resurrected before the angel even showed up. Look at the phrasing. "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen." Jesus is already alive before the two Marys show up to mourn his corpse. Jesus is alive before the stone is rolled away. And this is a really interesting idea, but there's this sense that Jesus could almost like teleport. On the road to Emmaus in Luke, Jesus shows up, and he's somehow able to disguise his appearance. And they don't recognize him, even though these two people seem to know Jesus very well. And he's talking to them, so why are you down? What's going on? Oh, well, this guy that we like, Jesus, he died. And they told him all about it. And they get to their house in Emmaus, and they sit down, and they break bread. They take communion together. And then all of a sudden they realize, wait, this is Jesus. And then he's gone. But another text, John 20, verse 19, on the evening of the first day of the week, when the disciples were together, so this is post-Jesus' crucifixion in John, post-resurrection, the evening of the first day, so this is Sunday evening, Jesus has risen, he's alive, he's doing his thing, he's walking around, possibly did the road to Emmaus story, he may have appeared to several other disciples, he's working his way to the disciples. And it says, when the disciples were together with the doors locked, because they were afraid the Pharisees would come for them and kill them too. You followed that Jesus guy, we're just going to root you out completely. We might as well just kill you all. We don't want this to spread like an infection. Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. There's almost a sense that they've got this door locked. You can almost, the windows are shut. They probably just have candles lit, and even though it's probably been like that all day, and they're just sitting there going, what do we do? What do we do? The Pharisees, the Jewish leaders, they might come for us. They might kill us. Like, we run, where do we go? We don't even know where to begin. Like, what do we do? And then all of a sudden, Jesus is there. Just there. There's almost a sense that Jesus can just warp all over the Jerusalem now that he wants. Anywhere he wants to be, he's there. And so there's this idea that the stone would not have kept Jesus in the tomb in Matthew. If Jesus was raised from the dead, the bandages falling off of his body, he could have just left when he was ready. He didn't need the stone to be rolled away. He didn't need to be rescued. Christ has risen. And there's a really interesting element with the guards, too. As I said, there's an irony to the fact that they collapse like dead men, but for them to fail at their job is a death sentence for them. Think of the story in Acts, in Philippi, when Paul and many others are in prison because they caused some problems for a local business leader. And an earthquake strikes, and all the jail cells open up, and the guard there wakes up and scrambles and sees them all open. He goes to kill himself. Because to fail at his job means he loses his honor, he would have had shame, his name, his family would have lost money and wealth and ability to make money and social standing. This would have been devastating. So he goes to kill himself, and Paul says, no, don't. None of us have left. We're all here. You're okay. And he becomes a Christian. He and his whole family turn in some way because Paul showed kindness to this guard and said, we don't have to leave. We can wait till morning. And so he does. And so there's this sense now that the guards have failed at their job. And in fact, we get this image. If you were to move on to the next section, the guards report, verse 11 of Matthew 28. While the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. Just pause. They told the chief priests, an angel showed up, rolled the stone away, there was an earthquake, and his body's gone. We have no idea what happened. And their response, when the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, you are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So lie, make yourselves look worse. Here's money for your trouble. Don't worry, we'll make sure you don't get killed. Can you imagine? There's a term called cognitive dissonance. It's the idea that you know something, but your brain refuses to line up with what you know as reality. You just can't bring yourself to acknowledge or understand what you know to be true. The guards report, an angel shows up, a stone is rolled away, there's an earthquake, his body is gone. We just fainted. And the chief priests and the elders devise a plan because they are so convinced that even if Jesus really did raise from the dead at this point, we still have to quash this rumor. So let's lie and spread this misinformation. And Matthew finishes here in verse 15. So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed, and this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. In fact, to this day, that is one of the reasons they don't really believe in Jesus. The disciples stole the body. Even though it makes no sense when you think about who the soldiers were, how they were trained. Just like falling asleep on the job would not have happened. Would not have happened. But this is only part of this story. Jesus' resurrection is only part of this story because Jesus does his first act of redemption immediately. Back in our text of verse 28, verse 7, then go quickly. So the angel's still giving Mary and Mary their instructions. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he is risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you. This is one of my favorite stories of Jesus' resurrection. Flip back with me to chapter 26, where we were a couple weeks ago. Verse 31. Jesus predicts Peter's denial. Then Jesus told him, this very night you will all fall away on account of me, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. Peter replied, even if all fall away on account of you, I never will. Very truly I tell you, Jesus answered, this very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Jesus makes this very dark prediction right before he goes to the garden and asks his disciples to just stay awake a little bit longer with me. Pray a little bit longer with me. Pray that you don't fall into temptation with me. He makes this prediction that you will all abandon me. You will all leave. You will all run. You will not be here. And the disciples, understandably, protest. They're shocked. But after I have risen, Jesus says, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. Jesus knew his disciples are going to abandon him. It was written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. But he does not hold that against them, even after everything happens exactly how it was supposed to. The angel tells Mary and the other Mary, go to Galilee, tell the disciples, I will be there for them, because they want to talk to them again. In fact, we know the other story. Peter goes and finds Jesus in Galilee, and they're having a meal, almost as if Jesus is trying to prove to them that I really am alive, I'm hungry, let's eat. And and then Jesus looks at Peter 3 times and says, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, of course I do. Of course I do. Feed my sheep. Feed my sheep, Peter, feed my sheep. After he asks Peter 3 times if he loves him, same number of times that Peter denied him, Jesus never changes his tone, never changes the mission he's giving Peter. He never says, Peter, you screwed up. You can't be my disciple anymore. He never says, Peter, we can't possibly work together anymore. I can't trust you. He does not say, Peter, you have to make restitution to me before you can serve me. He says, serve me now. Go feed my sheep. Go and teach my people. This element of redemption. Immediately after Jesus is raised from the dead, Peter, James, John, all the disciples are told, go to Galilee. He is looking for you there. Go home because he wants to see you again. And then the other element of this story that is just so crazy to me is this. Verse 8 of Matthew 28. So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly, Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshiped him. They fell on their faces before Jesus and grabbed his ankles, grabbed his feet, and worshiped him, prostrated on the ground. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." And this is what's crazy. In that day, women did not have power. Some women did. Most women didn't. In fact, to tell this story and say, oh, yeah, the first person that Jesus talked to after being raised from the dead was a couple of women. One of them, Mary Magdalene, was a former prostitute. They were the first ones to be told that Jesus was alive, the first ones to be given instructions by the risen King, the first one to see Jesus. Now, in our day and culture, this doesn't mean as much to us. We don't register the shock of this. But to a first century reader to hear, wait, he appeared to women first? They would have maybe not necessarily been disgusted or incredulous, but shocked. Well, your story has no credibility now. Why would you talk to women first? Talk to men first. Men telling the story give it weight and credibility. But God is all about the business of flipping paradigms on their head, and he instead showed up to women first and repeated the instruction, "Go and tell my disciples I want to see them again. Meet me in Galilee." An interesting element on the women's part and all the disciples' part, there's almost a tragedy to this. Back in verse 5, when we're looking at Jesus redeeming here, the angel says to the women, "Do not be afraid," because whenever God shows up or an angel shows up, that's almost the first thing he says every time. Don't be afraid. It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. I have things to tell you. Don't be afraid. Jesus even says it. So he says, "Greetings. Don't be afraid, but go to Galilee." The angel says, "Don't be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified." They're looking for a corpse, a dead body. And there's an irony to this. You see, back in Isaiah chapter 53, you don't need to flip there, I'll read this to you. Verse 10, Isaiah says this, "Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer." So God the Father wanted to crush the suffering servant. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. So even though the suffering servant is going to be crushed and defeated and an offering for sin, this servant will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand, because more are the children of the desolate woman than of her who has a husband. So the suffering servant, it was known that the Messiah was going to suffer but come back to life and see long days. And Jesus even says this too. You see, Matthew chapter 16, verse 21, that's only a couple pages back if you want to follow along. Matthew chapter 16, verse 21, Jesus has a conversation with them, and he asks them when they're at Caesarea Philippi, this beautiful location for pagan worship. It was a Roman cult. And he says, "Who do the people say I am? Who say the Son of Man is?" And they say, well, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, some say Jeremiah or one of the other prophets. Jesus says, "Okay, but what about you? What do you say?" And this is Peter's great declaration. "You are the Christ, Son of the living God." And Jesus goes on to give this blessing for Peter. Peter who denies him 3 times. Peter who utterly fails Jesus. Peter, the rock that God will build his church on. And in verse 21, Jesus predicts his death. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things at the hands of the elders and the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the 3rd day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Peter has this grand revelation about who Jesus is. And Jesus says, Excellent. That is exactly right. God told you this. By the way, I have to go die. But don't worry, I'll be raised back to life. And Peter Jesus, come here. You're crazy. You can't die, you're the Messiah. What are you talking about? Stop talking nonsense, Jesus. You don't know what you're saying. Because to rebuke is to tell someone off. Peter just told Jesus off. But would we have done any different? How often do we not understand Jesus when he speaks to us through his own word? The disciples didn't understand. No matter how many times Jesus told them, I'm gonna have to die, but don't worry, I'm coming back. They don't get it. And now even in Matthew 28, the women show up to see Jesus' corpse, even though they should be expecting an empty tomb. And so the element of redemption is there's no chastisement for the disciples or the women. I know you're looking for this man who was crucified, but he has risen. Go tell his disciples, God has a job for you because he is in the business of redeeming and not permanently punishing. Jesus' death on the cross was to pay for our sins. It is part 2. I don't know if you happen to watch my sermonette on Friday on the live stream, but this is part 2 of a 2-part story. The first part required his death. Jesus, as human, could bear the weight of sin because only a human can pay for the sins of the other humans. But only God could cover all of the sins. So Jesus, in his full humanity and full deity, was able to bear all of humanity's sins. But Good Friday is not the end of the story, because now Sunday morning, Jesus is alive. We do celebrate Christ and him crucified. That is an important element. If Christ did not die and raise from the dead, our faith is meaningless. And we shouldn't even be here. We should be out to breakfast or something. We're sleeping in. That would be delightful sometimes. But we're here because Christ has risen. He is indeed alive. And I wanted to paint Peter's story in this redeeming element of the resurrection story for this reason. Oftentimes, we want to say, there's no way that God could forgive me because of this thing that I did so many days, months, years ago. There's no way that God could forgive me because I'm a horrible person, because I've sinned so much, because I've hurt people that I love, because I've done these things. I have walked away from my faith twice. Once when I was a kid and once in college. And yet I'm here. Clearly, God still wants to use me. And there are other stories that we can find if we wanted, of gang members turned evangelists, druggies turned disciple makers, normal, ordinary people who don't understand how a loving, generous God could give up everything for them. Christ drank the cup of God's wrath for us. And as crazy as it may seem that God would give up his own son, his own life, would separate himself from God, from himself, Jesus from God, because he loves us so much, it still happened. God could not love you anymore, and he can't love you any less. Because to die for our sins on the cross is the most extreme way of saying I will do literally everything to have a relationship with you and be with you again. If you don't know Jesus, it's a God of hope who just wants to give you comfort and peace, strength to get through the difficult, trying times of our lives, the things that we will go through even though we don't want to. Becoming a Christian does not make our lives instantaneously easier, but it does make it better. There's more joy and hope. Even in the darkest, trying, most difficult times of our lives, there is hope for us because Jesus loved us so much that he would die for our sins. And if you do know Jesus today, but your relationship feels a little cold, a little distant, a little off. Sometimes it feels like I don't know Jesus the way I did last year, last month, or a couple years ago. That can change. Jesus is in the business of second, third, fourth, fifth chances. He is all about doing everything that he can to bring about hope and peace, redemption, and growth. He is not a God who wants to leave us where we are. Jesus does not love us for who we are because who we are is broken. Jesus loves us in spite of who we are and who he wants us to be. So we need to go in peace this week and go in peace today.